It's time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the Property Podcast. It is episode 111, or better known as 111. Thank you for joining us again. I'm Rob B. With me is Rob D. Very good morning to you, Rob. And as like last week, it is just about morning.
It is. It's another of those middle of the night ones, but no one seemed to mention anything about me dropping off last week. It sounds like it's been edited into some kind of semblance of order. So we'll do it again and hopefully get away with it. But this is an episode worth getting out of bed for, whatever time of day you're listening to it. Who should you vote for in the general election? We're only a week away. So we're going to be running through all the major parties, what their policies are, and what that might mean for us as investors. As Rob said last week, this is the first in a trilogy of sex, politics and religion that we're running at the moment. And so we're going to see how many people we can offend. No, it's not really. This is just a one-off, but it should be interesting.
We will do our best to stay impartial. We will just give you the facts and let you make the decisions. We're not here to sway you. We're not here to tell you what to do. This is just to make sure you're informed, because if you are a property investor, then the policies of the government will make a massive difference. But before we get into that, Rob, and this is related actually to what we're going to discuss today, the news article that you've picked out from The Guardian, and they've really held back on the views, the journalist on this one.
We do like to make jokes about headlines sometimes being a bit sensationalist, and here's a nice understated one. Let's regulate letting agents, the leeches sucking our wallets dry. These rip-off merchants have young people over a barrel, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, so this is a Guardian columnist who's basically talking about the outrageous fees that letting agents charge. And the reason I picked it out is because it's kind of interesting to see the strength of feeling around this issue. I mean, it's all quite ill-informed. Like, for example, it's talking about how you need a 6-week deposit, talking about it as if the deposit is a fee that letting agents charge, whereas it's not, and talking about how hard it is to get deposits back, whereas in fact the whole deposit thing is fairly well regulated, and actually the onus is on the landlord to prove that deductions need to be made. So the facts are all over the place, but the strength of feeling is there, and it's something that all parties are talking about in one form or another. But I thought it was interesting that no party is seriously talking about regulation for letting agents in general, which is weird to me, because there are obviously things in place like ALA and all kinds of other schemes, but it's an industry which has proved itself to be pretty awful for years and years and years now. So while I'm not a fan of regulation, it's an industry that seems like it might actually benefit from it, because there are lots of terrible letting agents out there. But it is a theme in the election nonetheless, and it's something which most of the parties have something to say about.
I do love this. Shelter wants letting agencies banned altogether. That's going to solve the housing crisis. Just knock on people's doors. Got anything to let? Why don't we then rule out cars, and then while we're at it, smash the internet on the head, and the world will be a better place. Oh my word, who comes up with these things? So there you go. Not sitting on the fence of that one. That's just ridiculous. But what is not ridiculous, or actually you could argue is ridiculous, is election time. And there's so much to take into consideration. So, Rob, should we jump straight into this week's core topic?
Yep, let's do it. So we've been looking through the manifestos, we've looked at the housing policies and picked out what we think are the key points. The best way to do it is just to go party by party, probably, and talk about what their policies are. So, Rob, why don't you kick us off?
So first up, the Conservatives, currently in power with Lib Dems. So their policies include building 200,000 starter homes for first-time buyers, to be sold at 20% below market value. Interesting. Extending the right to buy to housing association tenants. So the right to buy is where people are able to buy their own home from the government. And the help to buy scheme, they're going to extend that as well. So there's multiple policies there. I think it's fair to say, Rob, before we look at any of those, that generally amongst landlords, and this is not necessarily our view, but generally amongst landlords, Conservatives are seen as the most investor-friendly, the most friendly to property investors, or the least non-aggressive is probably a better way to describe it. I've seen a few polls out there by directed at property investors, and it seems Conservatives come out top on every single poll. And it's easy to see why. It's not because really what they want to do, it's what they don't want to do. And we'll come on to those shortly. But building more starter homes, yes, that's great. 200,000 over a term, so let's call that 4 years. 50,000 a year? Yeah, that's okay. It's not going to make a massive difference, but it's a move in the right direction. Extending right to buy. I do think this is quite interesting because they will plough all the money back in, which has been criticism of that scheme in the past, that not enough homes have been built on the back of it. So what they're going to do is they're going to sell some of the more expensive properties out there or encourage them to be sold, and then they can plough it back into more cost-effective areas and build more homes. So not actually a lot on housing from the Conservatives, but I think, as I've just mentioned, it's what they don't say that really speaks volumes here.
Yeah, exactly. And I was looking through the manifesto to make sure I hadn't missed anything, because there isn't anything about the lettings side of it. There's basically, they're talking about a few things to do with the supply side. They're talking about the right to buy and help to buy, but they don't have anything really to say about landlords, which is a good thing if you're a landlord, because surprise, surprise, no other party who does have something to say about landlords has got anything like free chocolates for landlords or anything like that. It's all more regulation. So a case in point is Labour, which is the next party we're going to talk about, who've got all kinds of things which are not investor friendly by any stretch of the imagination. But I mean, first of all, they are going to do the opposite of the Conservatives in that they're talking about abolishing the right to buy rather than extending it. They're also talking about building 200,000 new homes a year by the end of the next Parliament. If they do that, fantastic. That's exactly what we need. And then there's the mansion tax, which we've heard a lot about, which isn't going to be affecting me, I must say, but that's something which may or may not have an impact on the housing market, particularly at the high end, if that happens. But then on the letting side, there are all kinds of things. So you've probably heard about them talking about 3-year tenancies as standard with limited rent increases during the period. They also want to ban letting agent fees to tenants, and they want to have a national register of landlords. And I'm not too sure what that is or what the purpose of that is. But the main things that stick out there are obviously the 3-year tenancies and the ban on letting agents fees. The 3-year tenancies is one of those things that sounds like a really great idea, but if they do get into power, I can see this being watered down or not happening at all, because there seem to be lots of complications. And I was reading one quote from, I think it was someone at the National Landlords Association, saying that the idea where they've done this in other countries is they have like a 6-month probation period. And then after that 6 months, then it's like 3 years and it's very difficult to end the tenancy. So what's happening in where they do have this is that after 6 months, landlords kick the tenants out so they don't get stuck on this 3-year period. Therefore, it actually makes tenure even less secure for tenants because they're more likely to get removed after 6 months. I don't know if that's true or not, but you can see that they've tapped into the fact that there is a lot of public feeling around this issue and they are proposing to do things about it. Whether those make any sense or not, I don't really know. But as investors, it does seem like it's going to mean more regulation and less flexibility.
It does. I mean, the 200,000 homes to be built, yes, that's brilliant. Not quite what we need, actually, but it's more than we're doing now. If they achieve it, then that would be very good. So there's definitely positive things there. The mansion tax, I think that's political grandstanding like most of this. There's reports out there, one put together for the Centre for Policy Studies, and it basically slams it, doesn't really do much. We've already got the highest property taxes of most developed countries in the world, and the amount of revenues it will actually bring in is very, very small. It will add an extra, I think, 0.2% to the pot. So it's more about making a statement than actually doing something positive. Banning letting agent fees to tenants, you could say, well, Rob, you're biased there. But all I can assure you is that the landlords will then just have to pay more, and then the tenants will probably have to pay more because that would be passed on rent-wise. So it's just a way of redressing the shop window. And maybe there should be a limit on how much can be charged, because some letting agents are aggressive and charge far too much, notably London agencies. But banning it all together will just pass the costs down to tenants in the long run. And a national register of landlords, well, that just sounds like more paperwork. If it's done efficiently, then it could be a good thing. But knowing all government parties and all governments that have ever existed, it probably won't be done efficiently. So some good stuff, but a lot of policies there which probably are there more to win votes than actually be effective. Okay, so next up, Lib Dems. 200,000 sounded good new homes from Labour. Lib Dems want to go further, and they want to build 300,000 homes every year by 2020, and many of those in new garden cities. They want to encourage multi-year tenancies with inflation-linked rent rises, ban letting agent fees to tenants if the transparency requirements we introduced are not successful in bringing fees down to an affordable level by 2016. I quite like this, generally, across the market. This is not as a pro-party thing or a pro-investor thing. Just generally, they seem to be ticking most boxes. It's quite levelled. 300,000 homes new each year. If it can be done, and the keyword's if, then that's fantastic. I will wait to see if it can be done. But if they do it, that's incredible. Encourage multi-year tenancies. I like this. It's not saying it's not enforcing it. It's encouraging it. And they're saying they're not going to straight out ban letting agent fees. They're going to try and bring them down first by bringing out transparency measures and then potentially ban it. Again, as a letting agent, you may think I might not like that as we own one, but I think that's fair. So generally, some good policies, not too sensationalist, not necessarily there to try and win votes, some sensible policies.
Yeah, it does seem like they have a moderate version of many of the Labour policies. And multi-year tenancies is a case in point. Rather than enforcing it, encouraging it, fine. The thing about this is, what landlord would not want a multi-year tenancy if they could get it? If you've got a good tenant, then you want to have them for multiple years. Inflation-linked rent rises sounds pretty good. I don't put my rents up every year necessarily. I know a lot of landlords don't either. There's all this talk about rents going through the roof, but I don't think that's the experience of a lot of people. But if it can be encouraged, then fantastic. But it's a step of making it mandatory that it could have unintended consequences. So the Lib Dem policies do seem pretty balanced. The only thing to bear in mind, though, is it was a Lib Dem MP's private members bill that led to all the talk about retaliatory evictions, which then led to some legislation in the Deregulation Act, which has brought more kind of red tape and complications our way. So not necessarily completely investor friendly, but from what's in their manifesto, it does seem to be pretty moderate. A party that you could not really describe as pretty moderate is UKIP, and they've got a couple of things to say about housing. The thing that I like about the UKIP policies is that they are putting a big emphasis on brownfield development. So they're talking about, they haven't actually committed to a number of houses that they'll build, which I think in a way is fair enough, because when you just come out with a figure like 200,000 or 300,000, it's like brilliant, but do you actually have a plan for doing that? But what they are saying is they want more building on brownfield sites, with new homes built on these sites being exempt from stamp duty and grants for building on these sites, and so on and so on. The flip side of that, though, is that they're talking about protecting the green belt, which isn't necessarily in all areas, I think, the right approach. Something which they've said, but doesn't actually appear in the manifesto, is that they support the idea of housing benefit being paid to landlords rather than tenants, which that would be a huge vote winner among landlords who rent to housing benefit tenants, because the switch to actually paying it to the tenants has caused all manner of complication and difficulty, but that is not actually in the manifesto, so who knows whether they're still talking about doing that. The other notable thing is that unlike all the other parties who are talking about the supply of housing to buy and to rent and how to free up more and make it easier, UKIP aren't talking about that at all, because you talk about it being a demand problem because there's so much immigration, that means there aren't enough houses around. So you've got to kind of admire their ability to turn absolutely every issue around to immigration. And so as a result, there's not a great deal about housing in there.
And as there isn't, let's move on to the next party, and that's the Green Party. They plan to build 500,000 homes for social rent by scrapping tax relief on mortgage interest for landlords and phasing out ASTs to be replaced with assured tenancies. Not a lot, actually, on housing, surprisingly. Not any talk of building homes just generally. The Green Party actually do have a lot in their manifesto across the board and a lot of issues, but haven't really focused too much on property. Maybe understandably, it's not really one of their key vote winners, property investors, I imagine. So not too much in there policies-wise, Rob, but that's probably a good thing, judging on the party leader's interview, where she couldn't really remember most of them anyway. So the less you have, the easier it is to remember them, I guess.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone's heard this interview that Natalie Bennett gave on LBC, I think it was, when questioned about this policy, like to build 500,000 new homes by scrapping tax relief on mortgage interest and how that added up. She absolutely fell apart, and it was one of those really cringeworthy listens because, you know, tax relief on mortgage interest is worth a certain amount of money, enough to build 500,000 new homes. No, nowhere near. That's a classic example of something that sounds like a really great idea, but is never in reality going to happen. The same with phasing out ASTs and replacing them with assured tenancies. I mean, that's, again, it sounds good to the top people you're trying to appeal to, but again, is not going to happen. So, yeah, I think the fewer policies, the better there.
Yeah, definitely. And we're not picking on the Green Party. If, you're passionate about the Green Party, just property-wise, there's not much for us to discuss there.
So they are all the main parties, in England at least. Who should you vote for? Well, we're not going to tell you who to vote for. Of course we're not. But if you are voting with your own interests as an investor in mind, then there are clearly a couple of parties to avoid. That's all we'll say. Obviously, that's not the only thing that you'll be thinking about when you vote. But on housing alone, for you and the property part of your life in particular, you'll be able to tell from our discussion that there's a couple of parties which are definitely less friendly to landlords than others. As for the actual outcome, if we end up with a coalition and the Conservatives are leading that, it does seem likely that not a lot is going to happen because it's just not a focus for them at all. If there's a Labour-led coalition, then maybe there is going to be more legislation that's coming the way of landlords. The thing that all the big parties are talking about, quite rightly, is increasing supply. And it's great that that is being mentioned, but we've talked about this before, about how there's little political will to do what needs to be done. And again, it still seems like the case that there are no actual concrete plans. No one's particularly talking about how they're going to bring this about. And it doesn't seem to be near the top of anyone's agenda. So I think whoever gets in, we can expect another 5 years of disappointing performance on that front. But there is a really interesting thread on the Property Hub about this. It's another of those threads that just makes me feel so good about the Property Hub because it's one of those controversial hot button issues, but it's being debated very rationally, very level-headedly, and people making some really great points on that. So we're going to link to that thread in the show notes for this episode, which are at thepropertyhub.net/election. And if you've got your own views on the election, what's going to happen, who people should vote for, what the policies are best and worst, we would love to have them, and that thread would be a great place to contribute.
Phew! I tell you what, Rob, it is hard to discuss politics without putting your own opinions in there. So I hope you've enjoyed that. And I'm sure this episode is not there, as Rob said, to influence your opinion. And, the episode is not there to try and change you into one direction or another. It's to keep you informed. And I think that's the most important thing when we vote, is to be informed. Because the people who probably a lot of people find annoying, I won't say myself, are the people who are just partisan and will vote for a party no matter what they do. They can say we're going to nuke you all tomorrow, but just vote for us anyway, and they'll still vote. I think by understanding the policies, you can make informed decisions. So hopefully, from a property perspective, and if you're a property investor, you're now more informed. Time for our resource of the week before we lose any listeners. And our resource of the week is Fix My Street. Rob, I've not used this one. My street's not broken. But if your street is, how's this going to help?
Well, the interesting thing about this is obviously things do get broken. And if you try to report them to the council, it can be a right old pain and you don't really know who to speak to about it. What you can do on this is it makes it really easy to just put in your postcode. It brings up a map, and then you just click on the map where there's something that needs fixing, like there's an abandoned car or a build-up of rubbish, or the pavement's been cracked in some way. And then they will send it on to whichever local council it is for you. So you don't even need to know who the local council is. They'll just do it for you. So I've never actually used it in that way, but it is really useful if you do want to do that. But I thought it might be interesting for property investors as well, because you could actually go and see and put in the postcode of in an area that you're thinking about buying, and you can see what's going on there. You can see if there are any issues, and then you can see reports of how long it's taken to resolve various issues and all that kind of thing. So it's a really kind of micro, well, literally street level thing, but it's just another data point to put into the mix.
Yeah, it actually, isn't it just fantastic that things like this even exist? That's why we do the resource of the week, because There's just so much out there that people don't get to hear about. And this is, as a property investor, you may use it occasionally, if not at all, but just to know it exists and it's there is fantastic. You can find this in the future in our resources section on the Property Hub with all the other resources we've done as well. So go and have a look at that if you want to look through the back catalogue of all the things we've covered in the past. So we know it's a very popular segment of the show. Another popular segment of the show, at least with us, Rob, are the reviews. And this week, the review comes from Chris. And Chris says, "Hi guys, thanks for the content. This is the best podcast and indeed property website, thepropertyhub.net in brackets, I've come across. And all down to buying a book of yours from Amazon. Keep up the great site and podcasts, Chris. 5 stars. Well, thank you, Chris. It's a great review. Glad you liked the book, whichever one you found first. Rob's got a few, and then there's property investment tips. And I'm glad you've liked everything else we've done too. That really makes our day, so thank you.
And I hope that you're not a Green Party member, because we might have just lost you after all that. Thank you so much for that review. Thank you to everyone who's left us a review. We really, really appreciate it. It's what keeps us coming back and doing this every single week. Speaking of which, we will be back next week, of course, and we're going to be, well, keeping it somewhat controversial. We're going to be talking about clever tax strategies.
Oh, the Greens will love that. Oh, there we go. We've lost everyone in Brighton. Woo, okay, Rob. So before I cost us even more listeners, why don't we wrap it up for another week? That's probably the most controversial episode we've done, even though we pretty much for most of the time sat on the fence. Thank you for listening. If you do want to join a conversation, as Rob said, there's a fantastic thread that we'll link to in the show notes on the Property Hub. If you want to find the show notes, go to thepropertyhub.net/election. That's thepropertyhub.net/election. But until next week, thank you and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves the modern air miles.